Thank you. Before I start to talk about my subject today, I'd like to thank you and to say that I'm very honored to be here and talking to you, and very honored to be a part of CIRMMT, which I think is one of the most interesting organizations of its type in the world. I've been here in Montreal many, many times visiting CIRMMT, and I just think it's a fabulous and a very important vehicle for this kind of thought in the world. Now, what I'd like to do is to start talking today about life and music. And it has seemed to me to be over the last several years that, in fact, what musicians do is related to whatever else happens in the world today. So when the scientists discover atomic energy, musicians, believe it or not, have really adapted the same type of form that the scientists have suggested and that artists have done. And in short, at any time in history, what I'm saying is that we all do the same thing, and in the language in which we actually work. Now, in the early days of musical instruments, I would start with, in fact, with a violin, and I would say that the first violins, most very interesting ones, were Stradivarius, and they were 1680, around 1680, before, for example, the revolution of machinery and manufacture and so on. So with Stradivarius, every violin that he made was a work of art in itself. And I'm sure that you all remember what a violin looks like, that you hold it up like this, and you play it like that. And as you play it and as you draw a bow over the strings, really what you're doing is controlling the sound making that happens within the body of the instrument and the bridge that takes your message from the way you use the strings through the bridge into the body of the instrument, and it becomes very interesting and extremely beautiful if you can handle, in fact, if you can control the sound by playing with your bow the strings. It's really just a remarkable kind of idea. Well, that was really just before the Industrial Revolution, and very shortly after that, there was the pianos. The pianos, nothing is invented overnight. But a little bit into the whole thing, the pianos were invented by a woman who is Nanette Streicher, who was in Vienna. And she really took over a business that her father had been running and making pianos, early pianos. When he died, she took over the business, and she invited many people to come by and see her pianos, and they were kind of concerts every now and then, and Beethoven was one of her clients, so to speak. And I just thought, I've played some of those old pianos because I have a friend of mine is Richard Hester, who has made old pianos for a long time, and it's absolutely fascinating. Instead of stepping on pedals, for example, you'd move your knees upwards under the keyboard. And in the very early times, it was very, very hard to get a kind of long, deep feeling. I remember as a student, I was a pianist, and I was playing the Beethoven Waldstein Sonata, which starts pa 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 pam, and Beethoven was doing that not to repeat the notes so much, but to extend a sound that was really the only way to extend the sound, because they would die away so quickly, and so on. Just interesting little bits of things along the line of history. But after we get into the 19th century, all of this becomes a little bit better. Now, the instruments of this particular time were always a question of a controller which is to say the performer, and the sound maker, which, however the instrument worked, and some kind of a bridge between them so that the controller can, in fact, influence the sound making vis-a-vis this link or this connection. And that has been with us for many, many years and in many, many different ways. And you could say that, in fact, from that perspective, as I'm jumping into sort of the structure of these instruments, it's like a hierarchy. That is, the first group of instruments has someone on top, a controller, and then a lot of variables. And those variables are what happen in the instrument itself. The variables in a violin, for example, are really fairly complex reverberations. And then, why would someone play the violin is a question I could answer. I mean, I know violinists, I hardly know any violinists that don't take aspirin now and then or have problems under their cheek or something like that. It's one of the, if you ask me what is the most difficult instrument to live with, I would say violin. And given that, Stradivarius was not really taking into account the ease with which a human might work with it, but in fact, you might wonder why someone would play a violin, in fact, or why someone would play many of the stringed instruments, or any of the instruments for that matter. And in those early days, and coming up really to the recent past, people were playing musical instruments because they were expressing themselves, because it was a way of really saying something to the rest of the world and expressing their own emotions. And so you have, with what I would call a traditional instrument, you have the idea of a controller and someone who is making the sound, someone who is determining what the sound would be. Then that the instrument is a complex thing, which is a kind of hierarchy where you are the boss and you're really trying to make everything work. And then you're doing all of this because you want to communicate some of the very interesting things that you're thinking about. And it's altogether, it's very interesting, and it's a model, in fact, that in different ways comes up to where we are now today. So in the beginning of the 20th century, there was a kind of model of the violin, which is a sort of interesting model. Actually, what you're looking at right now on the screen is my model of it, but I'm going to take you through that in a different way. Right now, what I'm going to do is to give you a touch of Clara Rockmore. Now, what happened is that in about 1920, in Russia, in Moscow, theremin was a student in physics, and he showed people this particular thing that he had structured where you could move your hand in the air and have sound come out of it. And it was very, very interesting, and especially since Lenin at the time thought that the most important thing was to bring electricity to Russia, was told about this student, engineering student, and invited him to come and play. Well, theremin went to, or theremin as his name was at the time, visited Lenin in his office, and it was a long table, and there were several people sitting around the table, and Lenin was at the end of the table. And theremin came in and started and explained the instrument and started to play, and it was very well received, and Lenin thought that he would try, so theremin stood behind Lenin and held his arms like that. And then when he saw that Lenin was doing such a good job, he didn't help Lenin anymore, and Lenin continued to play the Swan, which is a lovely piece. In fact, it was, I think at that moment, the theremin became a Russian agent. But from that moment of Lenin, theremin began to tour Russia, bringing the idea of electricity to the country as a whole. Then went through Russia, and he filled the Paris Opera House, and then came to the United States in 1927, arriving in New York, and began to make his theremins in New York with the help of various people until 1938, in fact, when he left New York and went back to Russia. But I'd like to, one of the friends that he made was actually, turned out was Clara Rockmore, and that was her married name. And she arrived also in 1927, met theremin, they became very good friends, and she, after a few years, began to play theremin's theremin. And I'd like to play some of that for you. It really looks a little bit like what you saw on the screen, and it's two antennae, and here is the sound of it. Her sister is accompanying her. Every time I hear that, I am astonished because she's moving her hands in the air and making every little nuance in the air. And it's just stunning control and understanding what's happening, but really also what's happening there is that this is a model of a traditional instrument, because what you have is someone who is controlling the sound and who is listening to the sound that way. And that was the beginning, I'd say. It was not the very first thing in electronic-based instruments. There had been before that Thaddeus Cahill, who invented a keyboard-based instrument. Eventually it was made in New York. He had raised the money to do it at the turn of the century. His patent had come in 1897. And his instrument was put together in Connecticut and then brought down to New York on 39th Street. And where it was set up, and it took something like 30 railroad cars and 28 tons or so on to get the instrument working, but it was fairly successful in New York for a little while, except that the telephone had not yet been really made to work very well. And his idea was to go into houses and spread the word in houses and restaurants and other kinds of public places and provide a kind of music for them. But there wasn't it didn't work very well with telephone lines because the Navy, for example, was a little disturbed that they were being their ideas were being thwarted by listening to the Rossini Overture in New York Harbor, which was communicated through the telephone lines, and other people heard things or didn't hear them, and eventually it just didn't work. It was huge. It was the first time someone really developed that kind of an instrument, which is a keyboard instrument and an electronic instrument. And number one, definitely courageous, definitely interesting, but very big. Now things, however, right after that, and following again the theremin, worked beautifully. There was the And Martineau in France in 1928. There was the Trautonium in 1928 in Germany. There was the Hammond organ, which was the first thing that was really commercially successful, and there was Hugh LeCain with the electronic sackbut. Now, Hugh LeCain was working in Toronto, just down the street a little bit, and he, in 1954, I thought that it would be interesting to play his instrument, which is a smaller keyboard. So here is Hugh LeCain.
Many people think of the square wave as being basically unpleasant, but I think of it as having a poignant, mysterious, and rather melancholy quality.
Now, you could say that Hugh LeCain didn't carry things through enough. He started by working with the Canadian Council, and his idea was to make musical devices that could then be sold by Canadian merchants. Cain didn't get far enough with it before he got into a motorcycle accident and died prematurely. But he was one of the first people to work with a small keyboard that had, say, the potential for sales. Now, shortly after that, other people began, in fact, developing keyboards as, in different ways, the technologies became available. So I was in Rome at the time in Italy, and I was actually a roommate with John E. Eaton, who was a composer and who was very interested in electronic music at that time, and I knew very little about electronic music. But John had been friends with the inventor of the synket, which was Paul Ketoff. He was a radio engineer who was living in Rome, and he developed one of the first commercial synthesizers. He wasn't very commercial. He wasn't terribly commercial at all. He made less than a dozen instruments. But John became a very warm player of one of his first instruments, and it was one of my first exposures to electronic music that I turned pages for John at the first concert. So he actually was accompanying a singer in Rome. And very interestingly, one of the first examples of what we think of as a synthesizer. So here is just a little bit of John's piece. That'll give you an idea of one of the first concerts with a synthesizer that actually became publicly available. But there were two other situations of those synthesizers in the 60s, which was kind of fascinating because none of the inventors knew the other two people. Paul Kedoff did not know anyone else in the world was developing synthesizers. And in San Francisco, Don Buchla was developing a synthesizer. And the person that was playing it mostly at the time, and that became ultimately very famous for it, was Mort Subotnick playing Silver Apples of the Moon. And let me give you an idea of that. No, in fact, I met Mort at that time. That was about a week after the synthesizer was really finished, so it must have been late in the 60s, 1967, 68, something like that. And I visited him in New York, and he was sitting at a table with a rack full of connections and another rack full of connections and wires going back and forth between them. And Mort was using different kinds of devices to control the music from time to time. And at the same time that Mort was doing that and that it was being developed in Rome, Bob Moog was opening his door in upstate New York. I was in Italy just in time to turn pages for John, but shortly after that I came back to work in Albany, New York for the state university. And I was asked to set up an electronic music studio for them. And I went out to see Bob Moog because he was, for one thing, he lived fairly close to the university. And we became very good friends, actually, almost immediately. And I did buy a synthesizer from him, a very basic first synthesizer that he had developed. Hardly would you have guessed that these synthesizers would change the whole electronic artistic world. But I was very interested, and I spent $1,000 in grants for buying that first synthesizer. But I didn't have enough money to pay for the modules in the synthesizer itself, which greatly interested me. So I decided that I would buy what I needed to buy to make music and power the whole thing with a car battery. And so every week I took the car battery from the studio down to a gas station and recharged it and then brought it back to play another week's music. The next year I managed to get another grant and in fact buy a power supply and buy a few other things that made the studio a little bit more powerful and a little bit more interesting. Now, this meant that there were 3 people in the world in the mid-1960s that didn't know of each other's existence, and they were making synthesizers. And it was just a great time. I look upon that as one of the earliest times of the popular synthesizers that happened and of electronic music really getting a hold on people's imagination. The studio in Albany at the time, we were really quite active, and just at about one of those years, about 68, what happened, but there was the Bach played with a synthesizer, switched on Bach. And students came from all around the Albany area in buses to visit the studio at the university and to see the studio that made this particular thing. I remember I asked them, these were students that were maybe 12, 13, 14 years old. Wendy Carlos was the composer, and I asked them, how many of you have heard electronic music? And every hand went up in the class. And I said, and what did you hear? And they said, switched on Bach, switched on Bach. It was a terrific success, and electronic music in a very popular way sort of took off. But what happened also is that a lot of individual composers began to make their own instruments. And that was also fascinating. Michel Weisvis, who I don't have an example of music, but I do have an example of Michel, and I'm going to show it to you so that you can get an idea of what he looked like. There he is. Michel in holding what he called the hands. And so these were bits of controllers that were in his hands like that, and he could move his fingers and move them close together and up and down and so on, and stand just like that, nothing else, and move around and create music with it in that way. And very interesting to watch, very successful and great. There were many people like Michel. There was Leticia Sonami, who is here, and she's holding up what she called the ladies' hands. And the ladies' hands were a group of switches and connections and so on that she had in one of her hands, just one. And it came up, it was ladies' hands because she saw that it took over most of her arm, really. And she would just move her hand like that and move her body and so on. And so these all became wonderful theater pieces as well as music pieces, and starting off, I must say, with a very, very interesting look on what electronic music was doing to the art of music at the time, certainly breaking away from traditional ideas of what a sonata would be or what the music would be. Well, as time went on a little bit, the instruments continued, and they are still continuing, and there are many wonderful ones. And these are all done with under a traditional model, which is someone who's controlling the event, and then something, the event itself is the sound. So there is the controller, there is the link between what's being controlled and the sound itself. But that actually changed a little bit, and in fact, without knowing that I was coming up with something that was new again, and without knowing what Sal Martorano was doing, we were coming up with a different approach to making electronic music. I had found another grant that would help me create a very large and very intensive studio in that is to say, a device that had four bunches of equipment, and it was a very powerful studio. And I started by doing a piece called whoops. I do not want to play this there. Bolton Landing is the name of the piece, and now just as you listen to that a little bit, this is called Ideas of Movement at Bolton Landing. Not only new sounds, but also a new way of performing. So here I was using Bob Moog's equipment, oscillators, filters, many different things. And I was working with just movements of my hand with handles and changing what was playing and how it was playing. But the point is that most of this was happening randomly. And so what I was doing was interacting with actually what was produced randomly and changing the sounds as they happened. So if I heard a sound that I thought I didn't like very much, I could change it to do something else, and the sound then would change accordingly, and this could go on forever without any repetition whatsoever. So I was thinking to myself that this is a new kind of approach to what you would think of as music. Now, at the same time, I did not know that Sal Martorano at the University of Illinois had built his synthesizer. And there you see a picture of Sal. So Sal is, you can see the pointer, Sal is sitting there. This is a remarkable bit of very light material that he could push. He could push a thumbtack in it so that the bottom of the thumbtack would protrude a little bit from the bottom, and that was connected by a wire to another circuit. And Sal could then move by touching these kind of tabs and just move his hand down a row and move like that and control what was happening in the music part of this. And the music part going upwards was here he was connecting the digital part of it, which was his control, to, on top, this group of analog devices that were actually making the sounds. Years it took Sal to do this, using many friends and engineers to help. Very difficult to carry around because he had to take the whole thing apart and put into different boxes, and then put them back together again for concerts. Now I'd like to play a little bit of Sal's piece and point out that at this time in the history of electronic music, a new approach to making the music was happening between what I was doing with ideas of movement of bolt and landing and what Sal was doing. Were both really very, very interesting because they were all not performed in any single way. There was no idea of some controller about what was happening and then it would just turn into the music, because we didn't know what would happen, because there was a lot of randomness involved. So both of us, in different ways, were just interacting with what the equipment was producing and changing it in different ways. And we both did it without knowing what each other were doing. I met Sal a few years after that. But this is what his piece sounded like. Now, to make this even more interesting, Sal had 20 loudspeakers hanging around the ceiling, and the sounds were not only being made by the instrument, but being sent in different paths through the loudspeakers, so that if you were sitting within the room and listening, it was very, very stunning kind of thing. Where Sal, as a composer, was extremely interested in serialism, which was an outgrowth from Schoenberg's 12-tone system. So with serialism, it meant that you would calculate the notes, just calculate rules for the way you would use the notes in a composition. And Sal was very interested in seeing how this could be redone with randomness as well as calculation, and create this kind of a scene where you just didn't know what would happen next. And when Sal was moving his hand over the notes, he was doing it just what I was doing, which is you don't know what's coming next, but you're just moving from one moment to another and enjoying what the prospect was. So in a situation like that, you have a kind of interaction. So this is no longer the idea of someone who's in charge and who sends the messages through a bridge to make the sounds. There is no, it's not really a hierarchy here. It's what you're listening to what happens randomly, and you've created the field of variation, and then you decide how you're going to mix with that. And so Sal would do it by moving from thumbtack to thumbtack, and I would do it by working with these sticks. And it was a very interesting way of approaching that. I had named my piece, the entire name of it was Ideas of Movement of Bolt and Landing. Bolt and Landing is a little on the lake village on Lake George, just north of Albany, actually. And the ideas of movement came from Wallace Stevens, whose poetry I was very interested in at the time. And so ideas of movement at Bolton Landing were the idea of it. And the Bolton Landing came from David Smith, who was a magnificent American sculptor at the time, and who lived in Bolton Landing, and over a large bit of his land there was showing his sculptures. So in any case, that was the beginning of another approach to music that I thought was really very, very interesting, which was an approach that was using randomness, and that was interactive, because the performer, me or Sal, was always interacting with something that the device, that the instrument produced. Now I'd like to play you a minute or two of another example of interactive, which is again mine. And this is called Echoes. And here we have Jan Williams, the percussionist. What Jan had done, he was standing there, and he was surrounded by various equipment, Robert Moog's equipment, in fact. And there were 4 different channels of it that went out for 4 different loudspeakers around the room. And Jan had attached something at the end of a broomstick so that he could hold it in his hand like that and play the drums in different kinds of ways. And when he played a drum, what would happen is that the sound changed, would come out of one of the loudspeakers. And he didn't know which loudspeaker it came in, and he could never know ahead of time exactly what the sound would sound like, in fact, when it did come out of the loudspeakers. So that he was really acting with a kind of randomness as well. Once he heard the sound and made the next sound, he would make the next sound so that it would follow the previous one in an interesting way. And that was really, I thought, a very interesting way of doing it, especially since he was such a wonderful drummer. And here is just a bit of giving you a sense of it. Now, in the different steps one can take in a historical process, we started with having the idea of people who were just controllers and controlling sounds as they came out, for example, playing a violin. And now there is this idea that the controls really are kind of randomness, and that what you're doing is interacting with them, and you can set up what the ranges of variation might be, but you're never sure exactly what's going to happen. But there was another next step to take, which is another one, and which is where this comes into play. This was something that Bob Moog had done with me. He had designed the antennas. This here in the background was the first synclavier. It was the first digital synthesizer that was made, as far as I know, and there were some analog devices there and so on, and a computer there, and room for discs there, and it was kind of interesting. And what I was doing is playing a piece that was done the same way that you would do, from my perspective, a theremin. Now here, I was in a performance, standing like that, and with one hand I was deciding which of the 8 different instruments to bring into play, and over here just what was the duration of each of the sounds. So I could make the sounds very long, and I could bring in from 2 to 8 instruments, playing like that. But everything else was done randomly without my knowledge of what was going to happen. So I was in large part really guessing what would happen because I was always playing what the next note would be, not what's happening at the moment. So it's a very interesting thing. Here you had someone like me who was controlling this, you could say, but I wasn't really playing it. What was playing it was the connection between my controls and what was happening there. So it's in making the sound. So it's really a very different kind of approach to thinking about making musical instruments, which is to say, leaving some kind of complexity up to the nature of the instrument itself. Now, I'd like to take you just to the next step, which I would call emergence, and I want to take a minute or two to tell you also about sailing on Penobscot Bay. No, it wasn't Penobscot Bay. It was in the Atlantic, and it was off the Kennebunkport, the town of Kennebunkport. Sorry? Kennebunkport, yes? Yes. And it was on a 36-foot sloop that I was playing it. The owner of the sloop was standing by the mast, and he was shouting back to me. And here is just a sense of it. Doesn't that look great? And the idea was that he would shout back and say, steer 230 or something like that, and I had a big compass there, and I would try and steer 230, and of course I couldn't do it because the wind was pushing me in one direction and the sea was pushing me in another direction. There were waves that day and a lot of wind. And so I figured, well, how am I going to steer 230? And I thought that if I'm being pushed that way, then I am compensating to go in the other direction, that I had to get a sort of road that was wide enough that I could stay within, and did that, and so on. Now, what I have always thought of this as being a model, another way of thinking about structures particularly in musical instruments, because you have a lot of different things happening. You don't have someone that's in charge. No one is really in charge. You can't say that I was really guiding the boat. You can't say that it was just the wind or just the waves or just his shouts or whatever it was. It was a group of different things with equal power that were keeping the boat basically on a kind of general course. And this, incidentally, just to say in passing, is also something that's showing up in the structures of businesses where you don't have so much in depth with hierarchies, but rather with people at different levels doing what they do and cooperating together. And that was the way I sort of saw this and why I talk about sailing on a racing sloop. So one of the pieces that I did was in 200, and it was a piece by Chris Mann. And here is a picture of Chris, sorry. Here is a picture of Chris reading. Now, I am not doing anything to control any of the music in this case, but Chris is reading from a book that he wrote, and we have loudspeakers set up around the room.
It's on your She's a beautiful. The idea that a conversation is not just between two people. What's a kind of subsidiary hello? As we all know, satisfied. Hello, Bill. Remember, telephone, because you want to talk about who's dead. Because what's the thing because psychic sound about the army? With 2 billion people have seen $2 right now, 2 billion people know what they have to come down by choices we can hear. Now it's all about one spot of attack. Without the cries, 1, 2 was the saddest too. But an active software makes it cost therapy. The plugs and the selling deadline to the feature therapy. I was that was not the cost. When it's the first repetition, the first opportunity makes sense. Survive. Chain let it get you through the right now. So please lock it up by small action. G work, yellows for me. Grabby, you know, started by the track last time. I'm keeping score. It's only stretching the second syllable. It's also the same. So I began with these on as a
and sends them somewhere around the room, which in fact in this case does emphasize the nature of the voice.
The average English is 2 seconds, 72 phonics, and every 100 weeks, and every 100 weeks goes up. The measurement problems. Unlikely that we will get a use of the box much French. Unless the bad signatures about the contrast, because that's Kelly was also with Frank Guild has done Guild Lord Hannah Braun on, opinion about I'm sorry. Capitalism is a text, that's a colonization, you think of idealism. No, you don't have character coordination, rhetorically accident. But redundancy, complacent. Yeah. The paradox of the start. Each time the bourgeois paid for the house for truth to sentimental Microsoft ontology, the effect of the experiments are to the simple fiction.
Now, what Chris is doing is the beginning of a new approach to instrument making. Now, I'd like to just sort of summarize and come and conclude with this, that at the very beginning, you have instruments that are controlled by a single person, and that the idea of the person is to express oneself. And the controller then playing the violin is an example of playing any of these instruments, which I also feel is very often a punishment for a player of the instruments. I do know many spectacular violinists who have stopped playing because of the pain involved, but that's just a kind of example of the energy that it can take to play with those kinds of instruments where you have the controller, you have the bridge, and you have sounds coming out at the end. And then the next step is to think about, well, instead of knowing exactly where you're going with each piece, we're now interacting with it and having it go, say, where we'd like it to go, and which is a very different experience for a person involved. And it's no longer the idea of just wanting to express yourself, but it's the idea of showing the way things might work in the world. It's a question of how you would interact with society or interact with a social element or something of that sort, rather than thinking that you are expressing yourself in song or whatever. And it's interesting because you have that now starting in 1970s. So we've come quite a way. And then with sailing a ship in Penobscot Bay and having Chris also do his thing and something else is happening randomly and so on, and the sounds are coming around the room, is another kind of interesting way of thinking about doing the music, because you're not interested in something that you can sing in one note after another, in being able to write out a score, and there's nothing of the sort. It's a completely new approach to music where you might, in this case, work on a space and organize the space such that the sounds that you're developing as a composer will in fact come around the space and be a moment where you're living, and that this is a different way of thinking about music. I do want to say, however, at the same time, that the idea of a traditional musical instrument will always be there. We are always going to be, one of the things that we will be is wanting to express ourselves and wanting to communicate with other human beings. So of course we'll be doing instruments like that, and we'll continually, hopefully, be developing instruments that have ways of working without hurting the performer, and with having some very interesting ways of putting together sounds that you might enjoy working with. And as things develop along these ways, more and more I notice young people do not keep scores, do not decide exactly on what's happening, do not decide that they care so much about doing something that would present themselves to a public, but rather they develop something that everyone would be interested in and that would sort of fit into the world that we live in a different way. And that's, I think, a kind of remarkable, continual, ongoing growth in the way music is thought of. And I think that we'll be seeing a lot more of changes in music and of the use of music and in the future. And so, thank you very much. Thank you.
Now I'd like Isabel to come here so that we have a short ceremony to honor Joe.
Yeah, thank you very much for these, I guess, emerging ideas that you presented. It was very fascinating and very interesting for us to understand maybe where we come from. And now I'm kind of introducing Marcelo, who will, well, we're very pleased to offer you a lifetime membership. And Marcelo will, at CIRMMT, and Marcelo will kind of give a small talk. We are very pleased, and I'm on behalf of all CIRMMT members, thank you for all the great work that you kind of did on all these aspects. And yeah, I'm going then to give you a small something, but I'll let Marcelo talk to you a bit more about some things he wants to tell you.
Thank you.
Okay.
I'm afraid you have to repeat because I was in front of the camera. So.
I was not?
No, I was blocking the camera. So again, it's a pleasure to have Joe here, not because he's an amazing person himself, but for what he did to mostly computer music and electronic music in general. So Joe was born in 1938, it doesn't show. And basically a composer, author, and internationally recognized pioneer in the development of interactive music systems, and really in the 60s and 70s. So we're really talking pioneering here. I mentioned already a couple of things from his CV, but I think what was important, some very important stuff. So the coordinated electronic music studio at Albany. So that's a kind of landmark. Late 60s. Right, early 70s. So creating this together with Bob Moog, right? I mean, he designed and Bob Moog built. Again, you cannot get better than that. And it's so interesting because yesterday we had this workshop here about sound synthesis, analog, digital, hybrid, and beyond. And again, it's interesting to see this coming back, people buying modules and building large synthesizers and whatever. And this 50 years ago was really new, right? Nobody had done it before. But Joe also is very important as an entrepreneur. And he has, over the years, been involved in several companies and been involved in several softwares that actually were pretty important. So the software Play with Roger Myers, but also the software M with David Ziccarelli at Intelligent Music from the 80s and early 90s. So again, and for me personally, it was very important what Joe did as the founder of Electronic Music Foundation in the 90s. And EMF, Electronic Music Foundation, was the gateway to get into electronic music. And I was with known figures here doing a PhD at the time on the real underground center for computer music called IRCAM, right? Because it's under the Paris. And Philippe was my supervisor, and actually it was through EMF that I could get a lot of the amazing references. I bought Computer Music Tutorial by Curtis Rhodes. I bought your book, I think, from EMF. I bought Max Matthews' New Directions in Computer Music, I think, Matthews Pierce. CDs, you know, at the time, Amazon was not that common, right? So to get into this field, you know, it was thanks to this person here. So it's amazing, the contribution to the communities. It's something that, I mean, today we take for granted, right? To just go and get information, click somewhere and get everything you need. But even, it's not that late ago, it's 25 years, 23 years ago. Amazing contributions to the community in general. So not only as a composer, as an innovator, as a researcher, but also as an entrepreneur who made a lot of important contributions. Basically, Ear to the Earth is another more recent also direction about you know, being involved in ecology and what's happening around us. The book, as I mentioned already, in lots of fellowships and achievements, for instance, SEMUS, I never know how to pronounce this, Society of Electroacoustic Music in the US. SEMUS, yeah. Lifetime Achievement in 2007, yeah. So again, it's a very important, I think, life of contributions to this area, and I'm very happy to have Joe here, and together with CIRMMT, we can offer you second after Professor Bregman, who's sitting there, yes, was the first honorary lifetime member of CIRMMT. Now Joe Chadabe. So, yeah, welcome.
So in order to assure the continuous interaction, we prepared you a very small thing, but significant in the sense that it will allow you access to CIRMMT for your whenever you want to come. So you're welcome to come and continue the interaction with us and with everyone here. So it's a small wooden, how would you say that? Gravé, sorry, carved? Engraved CIRMMT working card.
Wow.
Thanks. Yeah, so you can access. Thank you very much, and
Oh.
nice.
Well, I'd like to say thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm very, very deeply honored. I've been looking at CIRMMT for the last 20, 30, 40 years, and I think it's an extraordinary organization, and I'm just delighted to be a part of it. And thank you.
With pleasure. Pleasure. So there's a reception. We can all celebrate together and continue the interaction together.
Great.
There's some random